if anyone is watching this and they're a fan of theories of everything, then I would suggest you subscribe to this channel, this Algo Podcast channel, because Amjad Hussain, like you've heard in every introduction virtually, that Amjad Hussain has been a huge supporter of this podcast since near its inception. This channel, Theories of Everything, wouldn't be what it is without Amjad's support. And additionally, Amjad has conversations on artificial intelligence and its connections to consciousness at times as well.
Following is my conversation with Curt Jaimungal. Curt is based in Toronto. He is the host of the world's most popular podcast, or one of the world's most popular podcasts, Theories of Everything. He is very interested and fascinated by consciousness, physics, quantum mechanics, unification theories, and all different point of views, mainstream, fringe point of views, all that good stuff. Curt is a brilliant filmmaker. He made this awesome documentary, Better Left Unsaid, Blue. I watched it. I really, really liked it. Curt has studied mathematics and physics at University of Toronto. Most importantly, Curt is my friend. We, in this conversation, talk a lot about Curt's own views on different theories and different people who he have spoken with, including the likes of Noam Chomsky, who Curt have spoken half dozen or more times on fascinating topics that nobody else talks to Noam Chomsky about, and much, much more. Hopefully, you're going to have a lot of fun watching this episode. I had a lot of fun having a conversation with Curt. This episode is going to come across as just two friends talking. And now, here is none other than Curt Jaimungal. Alrighty. Curt, man, how are you?
I'm well. How's it going, man?
Really, really good. I'm really looking forward to, man, just talking to you, catching up with you.
Yeah,
Big fan of you and Toe, and
well, Toll is a fan of you. The audience should know your name. You're a household name with them. Amjad Hussain.
So I'm so proud. I'm so proud of that. So let's maybe, since we talked about Toe, a topic that we both are very excited about, and your podcast that I'm a big, huge fan of. It looks like that you talk to two types of colleagues, people who are more in the idealist camp and the materialist camp. So just tell me the story a little bit about, your learnings, and both camps have their own take on consciousness. So start anywhere, Curt. I'm really,
Sure.
since you so keenly study before you talk to those folks, and that is one of the reason I'm a big fan of yours, that you put such genuine homework into it, and it reflects then in those conversations. So let's just get into your sort of, I'm sure that you're building some mental model or some architecture, a Curt Jaimungal architecture of a broader meta-toe. So, but let's start there.
Okay. Well, firstly, I wouldn't say that right now I'm building a toe or a Weltanschauung, as the audience knows. The reason I say that is that it goes like I study intensely a few weeks before, or sometimes, so let's say 3 weeks to 1 week before. And then I interview the person, and then I have to quickly move on to the next one. So it's like studying for an exam for a course, and then you pass the test, or you at least write the test. And then you keep doing that over and over and over. It's difficult because sometimes they build off one another. So when it comes to physics, it's much easier for me to integrate because firstly, that's a background of mine that I have. And then second, you generally build. There are plenty of connections. When it comes to philosophical theories of everything or theories of consciousness, those are much more difficult. It's as if there are different floating clouds in my head. And firstly, the cloud is a cloud, so it's bleary, it's indistinct. And then I don't have lines connecting them. And that's what would be required for me to have a model. It's like another way of thinking of this is a serial killer or someone who investigates a serial killer. They have those investigatory papers on the wall, and then they put the lines on, at least in movies, that's how it's displayed when they're trying to solve some mystery. For me, it's as if I have the papers on the walls, but the lines aren't there. And so I need to spend more time thinking about, well, if you read the Bible or read any religious text, it's not enough to read it. You have to meditate on it too. So it's as if I've read it, but not meditated.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So are you, Curt, yourself, are you more in the idealist camp,
No.
in the materialist camp,
No.
or you are just a student and trying to learn from everybody?
Yeah. I'm trying to learn. Yeah, I'm just trying to learn. I don't know. I also wonder how much of consciousness is fundamental versus material is fundamental is something like a duality. So for example, there's loop quantum gravity. That's Lee Smolin's baby. Well, it's not his, but he popularized it.
Yeah.
And then there's string theory. And then as Lee started studying string theory more and more, there's so many coincidences that there's just the amount of coincidences is overwhelming, even though there's no experimental support. And then there's connections between loop and string. And so Lee thinks, at least Lee thought when he published a book, I don't remember what it's called, but it was about 20 years ago, 15 years ago or so, that there's a duality between loop quantum gravity and string theory, whereas before they were seen as rivals. Now, perhaps there's a duality, duality has a specific mathematical meaning. So I'm unsure if he means it in a philosophical sense or in the mathematical sense, that like a statement in physics in loop quantum gravity can be rewritten in terms of a string theory statement, and they're both equally true in some manner. You can go in between them like languages. Either way, I'm also wondering how much of materialism is fundamental versus consciousness is fundamental, is that there's actually a duality there. Or that there's a third element that is more fundamental, which I try to pose to Rupert Spira, I try to pose to Leo Gura, and they tend to not accept it. Now, Thomas Campbell tends to accept that, or at least tends to.
Yeah.
See, in my own head, I think of Thomas Campbell's theory as not particularly formulated, even though he's a scientist. When I say formulated, I mean formal. Sorry, that's what I should say. Formal, as in mathematical, as in with symbols. And so because of that, I've listened to it. And that was my first taste of non-dualism or consciousness as fundamental. Then I moved on to other people. And because it was my first, I'm a judgmental person. So I unfairly judged it as, if I'm being honest, well, there's no way this could be exactly correct. I wasn't as, let's say, open-minded as I am now, even though I wouldn't call myself open-minded. And we can talk about the reasons why if you want later. Either way, I realized later that Thomas Campbell and I think extremely alike, that he's far more like me than I initially thought. I was just so obstinate I couldn't see it. So Thomas Campbell said, well, perhaps there is something outside consciousness. He was speaking to Rupert Spira, giving the same objections that I had. Not like he listened to me. We just think alike. And then Rupert gave the same objections, the same rebuttals back to Thomas, saying, well, how would you know? Isn't that not assigned in his lovely, velvety British voice? But Thomas Campbell said, well, perhaps there's something outside consciousness. See, the thing is, how do you know what's unknowable? If it's you may say, well, can you ever experience what's outside experience? By definition, I would say no. But then that doesn't mean that what's outside experience doesn't exist. Well, then you have to have a notion of what it means to exist. Either way, I'm not clear. I'm not set in materialism or whatever it is that consciousness is fundamental, what idealism, right? That's but ideal, yeah, right? Mind is fundamental, mind. Or whether there's a third element that we're not knowing, or whether it's an infinite amount of elements. This is something Richard Feynman hinted at when he said maybe there's not a toe, maybe it's like an onion, and maybe we just have to keep continually unwrapping it. So I don't know.
No, that is definitely very well exploring. One question maybe I'll ask you is, what is consciousness to you? Like, if you have to, not in very scientific terms, but just, we as friends talking, and you want to share your views on what your own consciousness is, and how you think about consciousness in general. Uh, would love to hear your perspective on that. I have some friends, and they hard to keep up with all the terminology. Some of them call themselves, amongst other things, panpsychists, and they believe everything. My pen has a little proto consciousness. Even an electron has a proto consciousness, because if it has to feel its quantum, if it can be in two quantum states, then when it is in that state, it is feeling that state, and it can't talk about it or whatever, but it has some. So I'm very interested in, first, how you, like, the software of our mind. We all are, like, using one of your guest Joscha Bach's sort of terminology, that we are characters in our own story that the mind writes. So in your story that your mind writes, how do you experience consciousness?
So you want to know how am I experiencing consciousness, or how do I define consciousness?
A little bit of both. I'm
Okay, so let's say,
your loosey goosey friend.
sure. Okay. So as for how I experience it, see, I think Sam Harris also said this. It's difficult to define consciousness without giving a synonym of consciousness. It's like, well, what's hate? Well, sorry, what's anger? Well, it's lividness. Okay, well, what's livid? What does it mean to be livid? Well, it's belligerence, or it's almost like those aren't synonyms, but you understand. What's the definition of consciousness? That's another tricky one. I was going to say it's that you can experience, that there's a feeling, there's a qualia associated with it, but then that just begs the question, what's experience, what's qualia? So I've been thinking about this, and I've come to a tentative conclusion, which is that to define, see, some people would say consciousness is all, and if that's the case, everything is consciousness. That's like the non-dualists or the idealists. If that is the case, then it makes sense that we can't define consciousness, because because to define means to set a boundary, means to demarcate, means to delineate, and you can't delineate, which would mean you'd have to separate it from what it's not. And it's difficult to what's not consciousness if consciousness is everything. So that's one technical reason why it would be difficult to define consciousness if consciousness was indeed fundamental. A second reason is that consciousness is intimately tied with meaning. And what I mean by meaning is something like qualia. Some other people mean implication for action. That's more of a pragmatic definition of meaning. But meaning is like, well, what's the meaning behind a cup? It means there's a meaning behind a cup. There's a meaning behind a chair. There's a meaning behind a number. It means something. What does meaning mean? That's actually an extremely difficult problem.
It is.
Okay, so then, well, what if consciousness is meaning? Like, I don't know how to formulate that formally. I don't know how to formulate that specifically. But let's imagine consciousness is intimately tied with meaning. such that I can say consciousness is meaning and we don't lose much meaning. Okay, if that's the case, then what's the definition? Well, definition is of some word is used in terms of, is defined in terms of other words, and those words have meaning. So what's the meaning of meaning? Then it would be, you would have to point to something outside meaning in order for you to explain meaning.
Do you feel,
Right,
Curt,
right.
in those moments stuck in a software program? When sometimes I ask those questions, so I'm a computer scientist by trade, or programmer by trade. So, so we all live by analogies, right? So I use this analogy of, okay, if there is some software running, and I have written a lot of software, I know how we as people write software, and then I sometimes try to me sometimes these meta consciousness questions, the ones that you are asking about meaning and more deeper questions, internally to me, they feel like as if I am stuck in a software program, that there is an end loop, there is nowhere else to go. I can go back, the door from which I entered, I can go back, to other parts, but I now have run into a wall. And no matter what I try, I can't, find my way through that wall. So I stuck, I feel it, okay, well, I now have hit, if I'm a software, as an analogy, then, and I'm, a character in my own software that has reflexive consciousness, I have run into some wall.
Yeah.
And so that is what, to me, sometimes perceiving and processing deeper questions like that you are asking, that is what it feels like to me.
Yeah. For me, I don't feel like that. Firstly, I don't think robotically. I don't think like Joscha Bach thinks. I don't think in terms of software. I used to think like that. I don't do that anymore. So that's that. And additionally, I don't feel stymied or hindered by the lack of progress that I'm making in these with regard to these questions, because each time I interview someone else or I learn some other theory of everything,
Yeah.
it's adding detail to the edges or even to the center. So it's adding embellishments where there were none before. And I'm able to see from another point of view, or I'm able to explain something that I wasn't able to before. So while almost on a minute to minute basis, I'm thinking about these questions, it's like they plague me. While they do, I also don't feel like I'm hitting against a wall. And the way a simple analogy would be, if you're a physics student, let's say an undergraduate, you're not hitting any walls because you can't come up with a quantum theory of gravity. You don't know enough to come up with a quantum theory of gravity. You have a vague idea that Neil deGrasse Tyson told you, that quantum mechanics and general relativity need to be merged and they're incompatible and they're infinities, but you have no idea what that means. You have no idea what the equations look like. You don't know what the exact problems are. You don't know what the attempts at solutions are. So you're not banging your head. You're just thinking, there's a mystery here. Let me read some more. Let me learn some more. Let me meditate some more, in the example of perhaps this, because it's related to consciousness. And then once I've done that, then I can say that I've banged my head against the wall. But right now I'm knocking on doors. I haven't tried each door, so I don't feel like I'm doing so unfruitfully.
No, that is so awesome, man. When I sometimes ask questions like, okay, if universe is everything and there is no outside, what does that feel like? Okay, and people then, professional physicists would say, well, that's a nonsensical question. It's an illogical question. And I would say, but if my mind is generating that, so I'm just trying to visualize what would the outside be like? Or if there is no outside, what would that be like? If there is no boundary, what would that geometry be like? And then I think about it, I say, okay, now I'm touching the apparently the limits of my own software, limits of my own natural language, my words, they start losing meaning, they become fuzzy. I can see that, I have run into some kind of a software loop. And again, the reason I think a lot in these sort of terms is occupational hazard. I'm a computer scientist by training, but that is the feeling, that I get from a consciousness perspective, that I'm kind of trapped in my body, that I can't escape. I'm a character, using Joscha Bach's terminology. I wake up every day. I mean, he have said it on your podcast as well, that I then see myself in this monkey's body. What do I do? So I quite honestly sometimes get that feeling as well. One thing you brought up qualia. I wanted to ask you, you think qualia is physical or it's something else? And I'll share with you a little neuroscience journey of my own on this whole pursuit of qualia. But first, you tell me, when you think of qualia, how do you describe it, or what does it feel to you, the whole qualia thing?
Okay, there are 3 points I want to say. So number one, firstly, if anyone is watching this and they're a fan of theories of everything, then I would suggest you subscribe to this channel, this Algo Podcast channel, because Amjad Hussain, like you've heard in every introduction virtually, that Amjad Hussain has been a huge supporter of this podcast since near its inception. This channel, Theories of Everything, wouldn't be what it is without Amjad's support. And additionally, Amjad has conversations on artificial intelligence and its connections to consciousness at times as well, which are related to the Theories of Everything podcast. So you could do the Theories of Everything podcast a great service by subscribing to Algo. By supporting Amjad, you're supporting the channel. So thank you for doing so. Okay, then number two, with regard to the question of, is there something outside the universe? And then a physicist may say that's a nonsensical question. I would say, in some sense, when they say it's a nonsense question, that what they mean is that I don't know how to solve I don't know. What they mean is I don't know how to make sense of it. And it's an extremely difficult problem to make sense of what doesn't make sense. That's extreme. That may be at the core of virtually all our problems. How do you make sense of what doesn't make sense? In fact, even some political problems, like some people say, well, the other side, they don't make sense. Okay, well, don't use that to denigrate them. Use that as an indication that you need to understand more. Because what people do, if you can't put yourself in the position that what someone else did, if you can't put yourself in the position to make a similar decision as someone else, then that means you don't have a flexible enough cognitive model, because you're human just like them. So that's what else I would say. Actually, there are 4 points. So that's number two. The number three is a sub point of number two. So 2B. 2B is when someone says that this doesn't make sense, this question of what's extra boundary when you're only within the boundary. Well, so what if that question doesn't make sense? Do you think that means that there's no point in pondering it? Are you going to tell Einstein that when he's thought about riding on a light beam that doesn't make sense? That's what led to special relativity. That actually doesn't make sense. That's a thought experiment that does not make sense, because the photon isn't an observer and you have mass with you, so you can't go at the speed of light. And then, so when someone says, well, don't think about what doesn't make sense, well, major breakthroughs wouldn't have happened unless we thought deeply about what seems at first hand to be incomprehensible and unfathomable and enigmatic.
No, that is so true. I'll share with you a little story about qualia, then we'll come to you, what you think about qualia. So when I started studying the whole consciousness thing from many different angles, philosophy and whatnot, because of my training, Curt, I pretty soon gravitated toward the neuroscience way of trying to understand consciousness, because I studied in my life a lot of circuits and networks, and I can, models and that sort of thing. So while people were talking about, this redness of red, and, that's not in nature, that's all the creation of consciousness. Um, and other such examples that are more cortical in processing happening in our cortex, I asked myself a question: okay, what is a very personal thing to be conscious of? I said, okay, it's pain, it's suffering, physical pain, any type of toothache, pain in some limb. So I started studying pain from a neuroscience perspective. And that is when things got really, really interesting for me as a student of neuroscience. I learned how different, without going into too much details, different sort of receptors in our skin, they, this nociception phenomenon, they take all these, signals, and, there is this transduction and transmission all the way to different centers of brain through these thalamocortical circuits going through thalamus and whatnot. But the most fascinating thing was, unless brain perceives it, there is no feeling of pain. And that is where, we all at one point in time or others, or our loved ones, benefit from anesthesia, and that it disturbs that pattern, and we are able to, even though we are being cut and whatnot, and we are not feeling,
and even though the nociceptors are firing, we still don't perceive it as pain.
Yeah, we don't, because we are not perceiving. So I said, okay, perception is important. Got it. But what is perception? So I started studying that a little bit. Again, this is a hobby for me. So then I ran into, the likes of Andy Clark and many others. And it looks like that the modern thinking about perception is, it is a construction. And then I said, okay, what do you mean that it is a construction? And the construction is that those perception circuits, they try to reconstruct whatever that signal is that they are receiving, and they are trying to figure out what the meaning is, and they create that meaning, and that is what is perception. That is what you feel, the pain and whatnot. And then I said, okay, as a circuit engineer, I'm feeling pain in my tooth, or feeling pain in my foot. And I wouldn't feel it at all if that perception, which is a construct, is not happening. But I said, I'm not feeling the pain here. I'm feeling it in my toe or in my tooth or wherever pain is coming from. So I learned that, okay, there is this sort of, somatosensory part of our cortex that has a map of the body. It knows where these signals are coming from. But I could not find a satisfactory answer that if that interpretation, that construction of perception is going on in the brain, oh, this is pain. But how am I actually feeling it in the toe, and not where that circuit is? Now, colleagues like Joscha Bach on your podcast or other podcasts, they would say consciousness is a simulation, brain is simulating a reality. You are a character in that simulation. So it feels really real to you, but it is not. I just, I'm not satisfied as much as I love Joscha, I'm not satisfied with that answer. So I am looking at it from the perspective of pain, because pain feels very real, very personal. And then on that study, Curt, I learned phantom limbs and phantom pain. And that was even mind boggling. And that was okay, people, due to some unfortunate event in their life, they get, some limb, or, whether in the legs or their arms get amputated and whatnot. So now the arm is not there, the leg is not there. But they are feeling intense pain in that leg, and it's phantom pain. And it's a huge topic of pain, how to treat, phantom pain. And it is an example of chronic pain. I learned the chronic pain, the acute pain, and the chronic pain is the pain that persists over time. So this phantom pain is a huge area of research, that there is no, there is no arm, there is no signal coming to the brain, there is no sense, there is no nociception signal being sent, that arm is not even there, but brain is generating immense pain in that phantom limb that does not exist. And there is some neuroscience explanations of how the somatosensory cortex still remembers or has a model of that limb that no longer physically exists. And there is some other trickery which kind of sounds like some hand wavy stuff for people to say, well, this is how pain is generated. But I say, okay, now I can see somebody is in extreme pain condition. They are being treated for that pain. The pain is not going away. They are physically, consciously experiencing it, that qualia, that pain. And it is coming from a part of body that does not even exist.
Right.
So because of, I'm a physicalist, so I'm a materialist, I'm a physicalist. I'm not an idealist. So from that perspective, I look at it things like from a neuroscience and circuit perspective. And so I find that just, it's just fascinating how perception, is a construct, but then something happens. Consciousness is not just perception. We perceive a lot of stuff that we are not conscious of. So that is some extra thing that, where we become conscious of our perceptions. So
Wait, what do you mean consciousness is not a perception? So you're saying, let's say we have someone with the pain from a phantom limb. So are you imagining that it's like that perceptions are like these balls on a table, and then our consciousness is what is like a lamp, and we shine lights on certain balls and not others?
I don't know. When I said that perception and consciousness are two different things, I read somewhere in a paper that these neuroscientists, they conduct all these experiments, then they report on their papers. And in some of these papers, they report that, hey, you are being, you are perceiving some visual stimuli. Somehow your unconscious mind knows about it. You're not conscious about it. When you ask, have you seen something or whatever, your answer is no. But there are other parts of their tests where they say, but it looks like you act, some part of your unconscious mind have seen it, or brain, and it is baked now into your behavior, even though you never consciously, you never consciously became aware. You never consciously experienced.
You were never conscious of it, yeah.
You were never conscious of that perception. So because I also at one point thought perception, consciousness, one and the same thing. Then on this journey, I learned the distinction that perception and consciousness are not the same thing in our mind. They are two different things.
See, I wouldn't say it like that. I would say it like you didn't perceive it, but it acted as a stimulus for you. So I'd make a distinction between stimulus and perception. That I wouldn't say that it went to your unconscious perceptions. To me, that's a misnomer. I mean, that's an oxymoron. It doesn't make sense, at least to me. I don't have a definition of perception that doesn't depend upon consciousness. I don't know what it means to perceive, or for what it would mean for my unconscious to perceive. I mean, I can imagine if the unconscious is conscious in its own way, like Carl Jung would say, then the unconscious can perceive, but that's only because the unconscious is conscious, not to us. There's a relationship.
I relate to that. I think there is a lot of truth in it that in dreams, many sort of characters or agents, using my computer science lingo, that I run into in those dream states of consciousness, they seem pretty conscious, pretty aware. I know that people who have tried DMT or other form of psychedelics, they then, say, okay, self gets dissolved, and you run into a lot of these, entities running around, and they seem very conscious. They seem very conscious. So you are right that even in dream states, I feel like that I'm running into agents or beings that have, their consciousness, which tells me that, I'm just one conscious entity, mostly, I think, in charge of this autonomous system. But there are other, entities running around in the brain, and I sometimes come across them during a dreamlike state. Also, on this comment, Curt, that I made, that I am a physicalist, and I believe it's a matter first kind of universe. One thing that since I study a lot of simulations and that kind of a thing, in the dream states, I see the predictive machine is trying to make some stable predictions, motion of different type or what have you. But eventually, it runs out of the juice, it collapses and whatnot. It is not, dreams are not very stable structures. Even though the mind is trying to make sense, it is using the same apparatus. So dream states are no different than stimulus or whatnot. So then the only difference that I say, okay, when I'm in a wake state and the universe across whatever I'm perceiving, this wake dream that I'm in, it is very stable. It does not crash all that often the way my dreams do. So from there I infer that, okay, there is this objective reality out there. It is not dependent upon my consciousness. If my consciousness ceases, it still would be there, and it has a lot more stability to it that my dreams do not have. So I think along those lines. But you tell me, how do you think about pain, or dreamlike states, and what do they mean how do you perceive them, or what do they mean to you?
Firstly, when it comes to dreams being as if they operate by their own logic, some people call it dream logic.
Yeah.
It's okay. You understand what a function is. So you have f, and then you have some domain, and it goes to an output. Let's say some domain set A, and then it goes to B. So f colon A dash, f colon A arrow B. Okay, so you understand that notation.
Yeah.
It seems like what dreams are doing are that they do operate by logic, but the logic isn't a rational logic, it's an emotional logic. So where you can be chased by a monster in your dream, and then you wake up and you have to tell your therapist about it, and then you find out that it's because you have a poor relationship with your mother, and you actually view your mother as a monster. Well, what does it mean to view your mother as a monster? You can think of that as, well, what does the monster mean? And then the monster means something horrible is going to happen to you, something like a foreboding impending doom. Okay, and it's chasing you and it's menacing. Okay, well, so it's like monster points to that qualia. Okay, monster points to that qualia. Your mother also points to that qualia. Now the monster like we see it as a symbol of that qualia. That's what symbols mean. So when you go into a dream, it's like what's happening is what would happen in your interpretations is the set. So you take your mother, that gets interpreted as doom, let's say. Okay. But also monster gets mapped to doom. Okay. So multiple things get mapped to doom. Okay. So it seems like what's happening in a dream is that you operate on the target set. So that's the emotions. Those are the qualia. And then it represents them to you with this inverse mapping. So it could be any of them. You could substitute your mother. You could substitute a monster. You could substitute a serial killer. You could substitute a claustrophobic room, because the inverse of doom is that for you. And so when you're in a dream, you're operating by, okay, well, what does this mean? And so it doesn't, rationally, we look at the domain set, but in dreams, it's as if you're just looking at the target set. Another reason why dreams need to be interpreted, because you have to figure out someone's own meaning, which is not an easy task. And then you need to think about, well, this means, and it's another reason why in a dream you can feel thirsty and you see a cup in front of you, you look away, you look back, and then it's a river. And in your dream, unless you're lucid dreaming, it all makes sense until you wake up. Then you're like, well, a river is not the same as a cup. Well, perhaps they both mean the same in the sense that it's of what quenches your thirst. So that's another way to think about it. Okay, then as for pain, I'm not going to answer.
Stick with that dream example for a sec. I was going to ask you this question. So I often wondered in my dreams, okay, I'm moving, I see a lot of stuff, I hear stuff. I sometimes even have that feeling of, falling. So what that feeling of falling is, my body simulates that. But I said, I very rarely in my dreams, I'm able to smell something or taste something. Why is that for me personally? So I don't have an answer to that other than that I found out that, most perceptive stuff is happening in the neocortex, but the sense of taste and sense of smell, it is going through that other inner part of the cortex, the insula, that is, kind of buried within the cortex, not visible. But again, I'm not making any claims or any of that. Do you in your dreams get a lot of sense of taste and smell? Or are your dreams more seeing, hearing, walking, talking, neocortical functions? Or do you taste stuff in your dreams and it feels like I have tasted, that food?
Yeah,
or
when I
have
lucid
smelled.
dream, I taste and I smell. But in regular dreams, I can't ever remember tasting or smelling. However, it also may be related to problems, because dreams seem to be trying to solve a problem that you can't solve in waking life, or that you need to pay attention to. So that's what the psychoanalyst would say, is that you have some major issue going on between, in our previous example, oneself and one's mother or one's grandmother or so on, or one's community or one's job. And it seems like maybe it's as simple as our problems generally aren't one of taste or smell. It's not like my life is horrible because I'm not smelling the smell of mint properly. It's horrible because I haven't stood up to my boss. I can't say no. I can't say yes. I self-sabotage or whatever it may be. And those aren't necessarily problems of taste or smell. So I imagine if one had a problem of taste or smell and it was important, then the dream would incorporate that. But this is a hypothesis that could be tested. Well, I don't know how you could get someone to say, okay, now control, you will have a taste problem and you will have a smell problem. I don't know how to do that.
No, I am I hear you, man. Hey, listen, you maybe we talk for a few minutes about Noam Chomsky. So certainly your conversations with Chomsky, I find them very original and refreshing. And the reason I say that, Curt, is for following reasons. First, most people who speak with Professor Chomsky, they want to talk about some world politics and
Let's
that
call
kind of
it
a thing.
Afghanistan.
Yeah, they want to talk about Afghanistan, Israel, that kind of a thing. So you totally stay clear of that, and I applaud you for that. It feels like that you have built a great relationship with him, and you talk about linguistics and consciousness and philosophy and all those things. So I was just going to ask you, what are certain things that you have learned that have stood out in all your conversations uh, with Professor Chomsky, who you call Noam because you know him. And so, uh, anything you want to share about all these? I don't even know of somebody like you who have spoken with uh, Chomsky, so many times and on all these different topics. And then, so tell me a little bit about what is sort of, if any uh, thoughts or wisdom come to your mind in terms of things that have stuck with you that he has said about the evolution of language or other things.
Yeah, I wrote one down. The I wrote one down a while ago, and it has to do with the difference between reference and referring, which we use them as synonyms in our everyday life. But many paradoxes can be solved by seeing the difference between reference and referring. So reference is a linguistic relation in the mind, and then the act of referring is an act. So it's like you refer to so and so, has to do with your body. I also am fascinated by people who are extreme intellect in academia, especially, who, well, you should be if you're a professor of academia. So professors would who don't take the materialist or physicalist stance. So the reason why is because it's like the default. And so I'm always interested when someone goes against the grain. And Chomsky takes not an idealist stance, but a
Yeah.
mysterious stance. I think it's mysterium, it may be called, his stance on consciousness, which is just like, who the heck knows? And it may be outside our ability as human beings. So that's what else I took away, is that I'm respectful of him because of that. What else? There's so much that I've spoken to him about, but to be quite frank, and the reason why I nodded when you said it's a great original interview is because I can nod and not feel as if I'm being arrogant, because the interviews don't depend on me, they depend on the wonderful audience questions. So I'm simply a vessel that gets to speak to Chomsky, and I act as if, or it's perceived as if, this is a high quality podcast when it's high quality questions from the audience. What I get from Chomsky, I I don't know. Most of the time I'm nervous when I'm speaking to him, so it's so difficult for me. It's also difficult for me to hear him when I'm speaking to him. I'm trying to pay attention, but I have to crank my volume all the way up, and that's not enough. So when I'm editing, I then crank it even higher. But in real time, it's difficult for me to hear what he's saying. And then in editing, I don't always get it because I'm editing at high speed to put out the interview quickly. So all of what he said, I don't remember, but I'm thinking maybe at some point we were talking off air. Maybe I'll write a Chomsky book, and it'll be as simple as compilations of questions that
Yeah.
he has, questions and answers that are based in psychology, linguistics, neuroscience, and so on, rather than politics.
No, no, that would be so wonderful uh, for you to do that for everybody. Look, I hope that uh, Chomsky gets to live a much longer life. He is I consider him as a gift uh, from somebody to humanity, and minds like that they're awesome. So I just love that. I'm a big, I don't understand everything that he said. I have watched all of your podcasts with him. The edited version with all the polish that you do,
Hmm.
then for a viewer like me, it comes across as super duper clear. So
It's
awesome.
clean.
Yeah. So thank you for that. I have few other things that I'm just gonna random things that I'm gonna share with you.
Rapid fire. Sure.
So I was once in this mental loop, struggling with space time and geometry and universe and how big it is and it has no edges and Big Bang and blah blah blah. And I'm not a physicist like you are a physicist. So this physicist friend of mine, uh, he said, here is one thing to think about: Big Bang. I said, okay, what is that? He said, okay, for a layman like me, he said, if it all started with something, let's say, size of a grapefruit, and now it is the
Yeah.
observable and unobservable universe. He said, well, then one way to think about is Big Bang happened everywhere.
Right.
So it happened in wherever you are right now.
Hmm.
It happened there. It is in you. You have this microwave background radiation, and you can see its asymmetry, that it was not, a symmetric thing. And that was the beauty. Luckily, due to that asymmetry, there is matter and no antimatter or less antimatter, and we exist, and light got out, and we are able to see all that wonderful stuff. And I just get just mind blown by somebody just telling me, because I did not think of that like that. I was thinking, silly, where is the center of the universe?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Probably there is somewhere a center, and that is where Big Bang happened. I didn't realize up till that
Yeah.
point that my friend said it. No, silly, it happened everywhere in the current
Hmm.
scheme of things. So you want to say, I know,
Hmm.
Kurt, you know a lot more about physics. So you want to say anything about uh,
Yeah.
Big Bang, quantum mechanics, or whatever the current state of physics is? So anything that you want to say?
Yeah. Firstly, I would say I'm not a physicist, even though you called me one. I'm not a mathematician or a scientist.
You at
For
least
sure.
studied mathematics and
Yeah. I'm
physics.
conversant in it. I'm conversant in it. Okay. As for the Big Bang, I find it silly. I find it a bit silly that, and I have a feeling it's driven by popular science, to take our current theories and extrapolate them to extremes that are, so whether it's spatial extremes or temporal extremes of the past or the future. So that is, the big crunch is going to, or the heat death of the universe. I find that extremely silly. And I also find the Big Bang to be somewhat silly. Now, the CMB, the cosmic microwave background radiation, that's more evidence for inflation, even though that's like not even some. Brian Keating would say, Curt, you can't falsify inflation. Well, I need to learn more about it, because what I'm saying comes from naivety. It's not evidence of the Big Bang, as far as I know. And the Big Bang is also, it also just to me means that there's a limitation in our theories. We obviously don't have a unified theory. When people say we have to unify, let me just go on a bit of a physics rant for you. And
Yeah.
maybe some people find it entertaining. You don't unify general relativity with quantum mechanics. You unify general relativity with QFT, with quantum field theory. Why would you unify with quantum mechanics? Quantum mechanics doesn't even have special relativity in it. So obviously you would like to unify it with, and it doesn't have the other forces. It doesn't have, and when people say forces, they should say interactions, because people would say, well, obviously you can't unify general relativity with them because gravity is not a force. Einstein said it's not. Yeah, but that's not where, when physicists say force, they shouldn't say force. They should say interactions. Anyway, and also it's also a misnomer. It's also false, that is, to say that general relativity hasn't been quantified. Sorry, it's also false to say that there hasn't been a unification of general relativity in quantum mechanics. There has, at large distances and low energies, not at high energies and low distances. Anyway, getting that out of the way. And by the way, the early universe seems to be in a place of high energy. So that's why we don't have a model of it. because we don't have a model of high energy general relativity in QFT. So it's a bit silly to look at our current equations, which we know are incomplete, and then extrapolate them back to the beginning and say, well, this is how the universe started. In the same way that this is how the universe will end, to me, is also a silly extrapolation.
To you, is mathematics a human invention language, or do you think it has some universality to it? If we ever were to encounter alien intelligences, or if we ever are able to speak with other smart creatures on Earth, like octopuses and even birds, do you think they have their own math? Aliens would have their own math. Is there any universality to math, or is it just another human language, in this case a more formal restricted language that have some predictive problem solving capability? Or is there some universality to it? Is pi something, as a function, a construction of our head, or is it, universal in that sense? Same thing with real numbers, natural numbers, complex numbers, the whole basic apparatus, the basic apparatus of mathematics.
See, you touched on some controversial issues when it comes to, because you also said natural numbers and the real numbers. Now, some people would say natural numbers are real, paradoxically, but real numbers aren't, because there is no, at least we don't have evidence for infinite precision. We have evidence of what's computation like that is Wolfram and Joscha Bach are computationalists.
Yeah.
But we don't have it. So we have evidence of natural numbers, but not of real numbers.
By the way, Curt, I'm a computationalist as well. As a computer scientist, only things that we can count, again, just training, but please go on.
Sure. See, for me, if one is a computationalist, one should be an ultra finitist. So computationalists and finitism go hand in hand. But then I don't see why one would be a finitist but not be an ultra finitist. And the distinction is that it may be that certain numbers don't exist. So if one's a finitist, one would use the natural numbers. But if one's an ultra finitist, one would say, no, the numbers that are greater than, let's say, the number of atoms in the universe times some other conditions, times some other conditions, times some other data, and so on. That's the highest number. But then that has its own problems, because then you could say, well, what's real when you say times some conditions? Can't you just infinitely make other connections and keep adding plus one to whatever finite number? So that has its own issues. But either way, that's finitism, ultra finitism. And then as for whether or not we share the language of math with aliens, I don't know. See, math, it sounds like math is capturing patterns that exist. And then I imagine when people say, do we share the language of math? It's not, do we share a squared equals b squared plus c squared, for example, because they wouldn't use that. We mean that general pattern, they would have their own way of modeling it or interpreting it. Okay.
If we were to draw a right angle triangle to an alien that even has more intelligence than we do you think they would be able to say, okay, this is what they are trying to tell us, that they have figured out that how the right angle triangle work? I know the limitation of our symbols, but the geometrical objects like a triangle, circles, it looks like the universe that we perceive, those types of things exist. So you think if we were to draw a circle or a triangle or a hexagon, or how our DNA molecule is, if we draw those things up, that other party would say, okay, I can have some model of your theory of mind, even though I don't understand your symbols yet, but I can think in my own consciousness what kind of mind you have, and then we can. Do you think that would be a good way to have? Maybe is geometry more of a universal language, you think?
I would say the aliens would have to be so similar to us. So when you say aliens, maybe maybe one is visualizing grays, like those alien grays, or Kodos and Kane from The Simpsons. And if so, then they have massive eyes and they're visual creatures, and they can perceive the Earth hypothetically, I mean, and if they can perceive the Earth, and the Earth is round, so I imagine they would recognize what a circle is. But if we're talking about general alien intelligence, alien meaning vastly different than us, then I don't see why it's inconceivable that they would have a different sense of, that they would actually have different patterns that aren't the same patterns that we have. So for example, it might be that what we call logic is actually not universal, even though we think it's universal. And it's difficult for me to understand what would it be like to have a universe without the same logic. But just because it's difficult for me to understand it doesn't mean it's not a possibility. And if that's a possibility, if logic is much like, it's just like the two of diamonds and there are many other cards, like I can't imagine that there would be, first of all, that many other cards, let alone any other cards. But maybe it is. Maybe it's just like that, in which case then their patterns wouldn't be the same. And it would be as if perhaps we wouldn't even be able to communicate. Perhaps we wouldn't be able to perceive one another. I believe Stephen Wolfram, though he's a computationalist, I believe he makes a similar argument that it'd be near impossible for us to communicate. The chances of us being able to perceive and communicate with an alien life are so drastically small because of the vast possibilities that exist.
Do you think, Curt, that because they might exist in their own spatio-temporal domain, meaning their temporal domains, spatial domain could be so different, and maybe we are electromagnetic creatures for the most part, our perception is largely electromagnetic, and that it is possible that we would not be even able to perceive them, let alone communicate with them, and that kind of a thing. Maybe they are all around us. Since you have talked to people in the UFO community and aliens and whatnot, what have you found most interesting in those conversations that stood out to you? Whether you believed in it or not, totally different thing, but you said, this is super interesting.
One is how many people that we would consider to be extremely credible under any other circumstance, being so adamant that what they saw is something like what we traditionally think of as UFOs. And they're independent. So that is, they had no communication with one another. They're far away from one another and they came to the same conclusion. So that's extremely interesting to me. It also doesn't seem to simply be artifacts of the equipment used to capture it, much like some of the people like Neil deGrasse Tyson or Mick West may say. Okay, number two is that if we're willing to convict someone based on, many convictions happen without DNA evidence. Many convictions happen, perhaps even most. It goes by witness testimonial upon witness testimonial. Okay, if we're willing to convict someone of rape, if we're willing to convict someone of murder, if we're willing to convict someone of fraud and so on, just based solely upon witness testimonial, there's far more witness testimonial for certain UFO cases than there are for certain, if not the majority of cases where we convict someone, where we put them in jail.
Do you think, Curt, that is it possible that those experiences are happening in some shared consciousness? That consciousness, like your friend and the guest Thomas Campbell and others talk about, that it is a network and it is not, one node. We are all conscious nodes on some network. So when they experience those things, you and I in those examples, aliens standing in front of us and we are mentally experiencing them, is it possible that some of us are having a shared conscious experience and it is all in consciousness, but not everybody there is able to see them and perceive, but some do? Do you think there is some plausibility for that?
So let's make a definition of what reality is. So what reality is, some physics some physicalists would say is consensus reality, something like that, where we have billions of people, and if we all dream the same dream, then it's reality.
Yeah.
And then what you're saying, I know, first of all, that's like a disputed concept because we don't all perceive the same anyway. So it's not as if we live in the same world phenomenologically. Okay, but let's put that aside. Then let's imagine there's 6 billion, almost 8 billion people. Let's imagine 5 of them. I imagine this is what you're saying, that 5 of them experience the same. And so it's a shared consciousness between a finite subset of this larger. Okay, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay, the reason why that sounds interesting, but the reason why I don't know if that's what's going on is because I haven't heard of a case where there's been a UFO in the sky and that a group of 6 people saw them, but then a 7th observer didn't see it. So like, what are you talking about? What are you looking at?
Yeah.
So that's never happened as far as I know.
All
and I would imagine that would happen.
They all saw that, they all experienced it.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Then one can say, well, those people who saw it were the ones that shared the same reality. But then that's an unfalsifiable claim because we can apply that to ourselves with the 6 billion. Just extend the 5 and just say with the 8 billion, that we all live in a 8 billion shared dream. And it's not as if, then that undermines some of physicalism because it's like a dream, unless one wants to say that a dream is physically based, in which case one would have to assume that first, and then one is proving the assumption.
What I found, so I certainly find all the things that you mentioned very interesting as well. I also find it very interesting that the stuff that the Navy officer, Commander Fravor, David Fravor,
Fravor,
what he reported, that was like as close to authentic as it can be. And the fact that authorities don't even want to acknowledge that or downplay it or don't want to openly admit it, it tells you there is something to it. Now, if you take, by the way, you should definitely, Curt, talk to Commander Dave Fravor if you can, find your way to him. I think that would be another awesome podcast for your viewers like me. But what they experienced, him and his crew, first of all, totally legit. They captured it as well. And then I just think, the stuff that they mentioned, hey, it moved in a weird fashion and it defied gravity and whatnot. Maybe it did not have a mass. Maybe it was a hologram. Maybe it was some totally believable image that, some because as a physicalist, I would say, okay, physics does not cheat if that thing that I'm consciously observing and it is hitting my electromagnetic equipment as well, like my radars and stuff, and it is behaving in a way that the type of objects that we have don't behave, well, that means it's not as if that my physics is wrong. It is using some different physics, some other physical mechanism that, either I don't know what that physical mechanism is, or something along those lines. I never doubt in my mind that those things are not legit. They are there, but it looks like they are following some different physics. That's why I'm so interested one of these days you talking to Bob Lazar. I know that he's probably the most controversial person on that, but I think every time I have heard him, whether on long time back on those George Knapp interviews or as of late on Joe Rogan, he comes across, and I'm not saying that I'm some people expert or an FBI profiler, but just human to human feeling. When you listen to Bob Lazar, it doesn't feel like, my system does not compute, look, he's making it up, he is scheming it. He comes across as a normal, genuine person. He comes across as annoyed because somebody drags him into
Yeah,
a
yeah.
conversation that he doesn't even want to be in that discussion and that kind of thing. But somebody, a friend or a loved one, they just force him that please, 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 let's have a chat with Joe Rogan,
Yeah.
whatever. So I find him, Bob Lazar's, entire sort of, what he describes again to me as a person, as Amjad, it doesn't come across to me as if he's lying.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go through a few of those. So number one, David Fravor. There's the potential that I could get David Fravor on the podcast. The only issue is that Lex and Rogan did Fravor so well that I don't see if there's any I don't see that there's any other angle I can take that would be fresh. And for the Toe podcast, I'd like to make sure that someone who's watched all the interviews with this person, every interview with them, that they'll find major new revelations in this interview. Let's say it's majorly new. Okay. So there's that. Then with regard to Bob Lazar, it's seeming like Bob already said no many times to come on the podcast. Luckily, he's actually gotten back to me. But he also said that he's willing to talk to me about the specific technical details when he has the time off air. And that's actually what I'm mainly interested in as someone who's interested in physics, particularly because he called the strong force another version of gravity, maybe gravity A or gravity B, I don't recall. And that to me implies a unification, which I haven't heard before. Okay, then 3, when it comes to whether or not these are holograms, well, that's called spoofing. There's a technical term for that. Yeah, you can look this up in the UFO terminology. It's called spoofing, I believe. Okay. The reason why I don't think that's the case necessarily, at least not a hologram that we know, in which case, remember the driving force behind the question was that our physics is pretty solid. We have a solid understanding of the world. So if something defies the physics, it's prosaic to think, well, it actually follows our physics. It's just not the same. It's not what we think it is. It's not a solid mass. Let's say it's some light. Well, firstly, with some of these, with radar, it's not as if light reflects with light to bounce back in that same manner. So if it was a hologram, it wouldn't be picked up in radar in the same way. Secondly, this is one of the reasons I asked Luis Elizondo if they have images or video, more specifically, do they have video of trans, I believe it's called transmedium transportation. So that is, it's going from air to water. And he said yes. And I said, is there a splash? And he said yes. So there's splash. There's a splash when it goes under the water. Yeah, and it would be strange if they also manufactured that splash. And just so you know, from David Fravor's account, when it was maneuvering above the water, there was also some white water around it. So that was right.
And I think that he then argued that there was some structure then probably underneath.
Yeah, I don't know why he thinks that though. I don't know why he thinks that, because to me it would make sense that there would be some water manipulation if you're moving quickly directly above the water. So I don't know why he's surmising that there exists.
I think, Curt, when you talk to him, you should just purely, as opposed to everybody else wants to know the story of what happened with it. I think you should only examine it
technicalities.
Physics, technicality, just the physics angle of it.
Yeah. Well, I'm a punctilious person, so I can get into that.
Alrighty. So tell me what have been your most favorite guests on your show.
Okay.
So then I'll tell you. I'll tell you then my favorite.
Sure. I'm not being rude. I'm going through my guest list because I want to give you a fresh perspective, an original, not planned. Oh, so right now I have Jonathan Blow premiering, which I got to check on. One of my favorites, by the way, was a guest that never appeared, which is strange, but it was my reading of Raymond Smullyan's Is God a Taoist? Raymond Smullyan, man, okay, so there's 3 people I want on the channel. There's Raymond Smullyan, Hillary Putnam, and Douglas Hofstadter. Hillary Putnam and Raymond Smullyan are dead, so I can't have them, but if I wish
you should hurry regarding Professor Doug Hofstadter.
Yeah, I'm working on that. Okay, so I would say Raymond Smully in my reading of Is God a Taoist is one of my favorites, mainly not because it's my reading of it, but because I love Raymond Smulyan's work. Chris Langan, I loved speaking with Chris Langan. I also liked or loved Bernardo Kastrup and Ian McGilchrist. I'd say those are my favorite.
Bernardo and Ian, they were my favorite as well. I really, really liked your conversation with Joscha as well, and just a lot of similarities. Uh, Anil Seth on neuroscience, I find him a very original voice within the neuroscience community. Uh, and then Stuart Hameroff. And in fact, I was able to, Curt, speak with Stuart a
Oh,
few
great.
weeks ago as well.
Oh, yeah.
And
Did you mention the podcast at all?
I did, and then I was drawn to him because he has spent 3 decades. He's a practicing anesthesiologist,
Hmm.
and he does consciousness. Like his, I wouldn't call it a hobby. It is like a second career that he runs in parallel. But he knows so much about the processes and mechanisms of anesthesia that disturb consciousness. And then him and Roger Penrose, they have this quantum
Yeah.
mechanical theory of consciousness and whatnot. So no, those are my. I'm looking at your uh, guest list myself. So certainly Noam Chomsky, love that. And I'm just like many of your followers of your podcast and your viewers, I am drawn to the whole ufology alien scene. It's like maybe a mind drug. So during daytime, I'm a computer scientist and that kind of a thing. But I find, man, those conversations very joyful. So here's one naughty thing that I'm going to say, and please don't do
Sure.
that. The naughty thing is, what would it be like, Kurt, if we were to bring Bernardo Castro and
Hmm.
Joscha Bach together on
Hmm.
your podcast after they have said all those things
Yeah.
about each other, not
I would
only in
love
your
that.
forum but in other forum. That would be fun. No, I love Bernardo and I love Joscha for independent reasons. People can have professional differences. That is totally cool. uh, hey, the last thing I'll tell you is,
Oh, wait, I would
I
like to comment on that. Can you hold
okay,
your last thing?
go ahead.
Okay, please hold it. Please hold it. Do you have it in
Ho-
your head?
no, yeah, I have it in my head.
Okay. On Yoshabak and Bernardo, I don't think that's going to happen. I've spoken to them and well, one of them, I'm not going to say who, one of them is wholly uninterested in speaking with the other.
Yeah,
Okay, so that's that.
I would, if I were to make a guess, probably Yasha, but could be the
Yeah.
other way around. Could be the other way around as well. It would be fun to, if people have professional differences, disagreements. It just would be fun to have that chat. The last thing that I was going to say
Yeah.
was, when I watched your movie Better Left Unsaid, or Blue as you call it,
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
was, man, blown away. I was blown away by a few things. First, uh, the quality of filming, direction, that
Thanks.
how
Thank you.
well it was put together. And then second, I was drawn to its content. You spoke my ideas. It was like, my views. And even
Hmm.
though, Kurt, I am a, uh, maybe when it comes to uh, fiscal stuff, I am conservative. And when it comes to science stuff, I think I have liberal views. I would like to do all kind of
Yeah, they're
scientific,
libertarian.
scientific,
Yeah.
yeah, that kind of a thing. So, but I, find these extremist views so, sort of bizarre. And then, because if you don't have common ground, if you don't take some kind of a centrist approach, if you don't have an empathy for others, then no communication is not even possible, and then and we are doomed. So anyways, I am a big fan of that movie. I hope that you have other movie projects down the road, and I know that me, like many other fans of Toe, we always keep looking to your next episode and the next and all that good stuff. So uh, I really, on behalf of, I think I can say this, on behalf of all of your followers and fans, genuine thank you of bringing all this wonderful content and conversations to life. It's a joy. It is indeed a gift. I have told you this thing, off camera. I often feel I'm indebted to you because of what you are doing. And it is such an original thing. And my strong sort of, request is please keep doing that. And you are on a great track. And I love it. I love it. Your podcast, to me, it's like, that's my, when I have some time, to say, okay, let me go do some mind stuff. I just put one of your podcasts on, and I listen. I'm also doing my own thinking, some daydreaming, that kind of a thing. So I'm sure that there are many other people who are like that. So thank you.
Thank you. Can I comment on that quickly?
Please.
Okay. As for continuing to do the podcast, I do imagine that the podcast has a time limit, in the sense that it's goal driven. Like, it's not like other podcasts. I'm not denigrating Rogan at all. Like, Rogan is a titan of titans. Okay, so how about I don't even mention Rogan? How about some other podcasters? I feel like what they do is they just interview for the sake of interviewing. There's no goal behind it. They're just, whether it's money or whether it's they would like more followers or whether it's just because they feel like they have to. I don't know why, but I see some people just interview for the sake of interviewing. There's a goal behind this channel, and that is the explication of toes.
Yeah.
And so there's a finite list of toes. Well, there's a finite list of people. So that means, and I've done a back of the envelope calculation, and it's about 3 years. So I imagine the channel will keep going for 3 years, but we'll see what happens after that. And then number two, when you said the followers of Curt, I would say that's another oxymoron. The reason why I'd say that is that it's almost like a barber that shaves all the people that don't shave themselves paradox. Because if one is a follower, quote unquote follower of Curt, they wouldn't be a follower of Curt. And the reason is that what I say with the channel is there's two values, truth and love. And I'm not sure which one comes first. I imagine love does. But if one is truthful, one realizes that one knows extremely little. And I'm not saying to be open-minded. As much as some people call me open-minded, I would call myself asinine, and it comes across as open-minded. It's just that I know so little that I ask questions like a child. Either way, if one was a quote-unquote follower of Curt, they would know that one should question and constantly question, if as much as one can handle. Like, don't do that because it can destroy you, but as much as one can handle. And then thus that means you don't follow anyone necessarily. So if one was a true follower of the channel, one wouldn't be a follower of the channel. That's what I wanted to say.
Very well, very, very well said. Curt, man, I love you, man. So I think thank you for being so gracious with your time today. And yeah, I'm just feeling blessed. So I think it's a good time to bring our conversation to closure. I look forward to our many, many interactions in the future. I count you, man, as a friend. And so
that's for sure.
Yeah.
Love you, man. And if you would like to record one in person whenever we do meet up, which I'm sure that'll occur, we can do that as well.
We will. I'm sure that one of these days we'll would be able to. I think the U.S.-Canadian border is finally open. I think
we'll
that
see.
now.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think you can come here. I don't know if I can go there. All right,
Yep,
man.
you guys are so welcoming. All right, man. Thank you, sir.
Take care.